A lot of people think that The Lord of the Rings happens in a fantasy world, but it doesn't. It happens in our world. Many fantasy worlds don't seem to exist anywhere. They happen in like a parallel universe that, I don't know. But Middle-earth isn't like that. It's intended to be what Tolkien calls a mythical prehistory of Europe. You'll find people on the internet who think it's ambiguous, that Tolkien wrote a mythology for England but not about England, but they're just wrong. Tolkien made many statements otherwise, and you can find them all throughout his life. Let's just start with this quote. Middle-earth is our world. I have, of course, placed the action in a purely imaginary, though not wholly impossible, period of antiquity in which the shape of the continental masses was different. Some people might say, well, he started out that way, but he changed his intention by the time The Lord of the Rings came out. But, like I said, he made these statements all throughout his life. Let's just go through a few by year. By the way, The Fellowship of the Ring came out in 1954, The Two Towers came out in 1954, and The Return of the King came out in 1955. Okay, here's a quote from 1955. Middle-earth, by the way, is not a name of a Never-Never Land without relation to the world we live in. And though I have not attempted to relate the shape of the mountains and land masses to what geologists may say or surmise about the nearer past, imaginatively, this history is supposed to take place in a period of the actual old world of this planet. 1956. Mine is not an imaginary world, but an imaginary historical moment on Middle-earth, which is our habitation. 1956. The theater of my tale is this earth, the one in which we now live, but the historical period is imaginary. The essentials of that abiding place are all there, at any rate for inhabitants of northwestern Europe. So naturally it feels familiar, even if a little glorified by the enchantment of distance and time. 1958. The Lord of the Rings may be a fairy story, but it takes place in the northern hemisphere of this earth. Miles are miles, days are days, weather is weather. 1967. The action of the story takes place in the northwest of Middle-earth, equivalent in latitude to the coastlands of Europe and the north shores of the Mediterranean. The next question is why? Why did he do this, and why should we care? To answer that question, we need to go back to why Tolkien created Middle-earth in the first place. There's a really famous letter that Tolkien wrote to a publisher in which he explains his intention for creating Middle-earth and writing Lord of the Rings. I was from early days grieved by the poverty of my own beloved country. It had no stories of its own, bound up with its tongue and soil, not of the quality that I sought and found as an ingredient in legends of other lands. But once upon a time, my crest has long since fallen, I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. The way Tolkien did this was to create Middle-earth, which is what he called a mythical prehistory. We even get geographical and chronological connections with Europe. He admittedly said, I do sometimes wish that I had made some sort of agreement between the imaginations or theories of the geologists and my map a little more possible. Despite that, he did attempt some geological connections. The action of the story takes place in the northwest of Middle-earth, equivalent in latitude to the coastlands of Europe and the north shores of the Mediterranean. If Hobbiton and Rivendell are taken, as intended, to be about the latitude of Oxford, then Minas Tirith, 600 miles south, is at about the latitude of Florence. The mouths of Anduin and the ancient city of Pelargir are at about the latitude of ancient Troy. Here are some chronological connections as well. The story is really a story of what happened in BC year X. I hope the evidently long but undefined gap in time between the fall of Barad-dûr and our days is sufficient for literary credibility, even for readers acquainted with what is known or surmised of prehistory. And as a note, he says, I imagine the gap to be about 6,000 years. The reason for these connections is that Tolkien viewed Middle-earth and The Lord of the Rings as myth passing into ordinary history. That's why the elves leave at the end of The Lord of the Rings, because it represents the realm of myth passing into the realm of ordinary history. I know what some of you are thinking, but the cultures of Middle-earth are clearly medieval. They have chainmail, plate armor, stirrups, medieval-style masonry, etc. And Tolkien acknowledged these inconsistencies, which is why he called it an imaginary historical moment. But he was still intending Middle-earth to contain real-world cultures and landscapes. He even edited the feather in Tom Bombadil's cap from a peacock to a kingfisher because peacocks are not native to England, but kingfishers are. Tolkien identified the Bayeux Tapestry depicting events in 1066 as a good representation of the Riders of Rohan. So overall, Middle-earth is intended to be a mythical prehistory of Europe, representing the realm of myth passing into the realm of ordinary history. Let me point out one example of this in The Lord of the Rings. In the Fellowship of the Ring, Frodo and the hobbits are sitting at the inn of the Prancing Pony. The crowd gets rowdy and starts asking the hobbits for a song. For a moment, Frodo stood gaping. Then, in desperation, he began a ridiculous song that Bilbo had been rather fond of, and indeed rather proud of, for he had made up the words himself. It was about an inn, and that is probably why it came into Frodo's mind just then. Here it is in full. Only a few words of it are now, as a rule, remembered. This song is about 2 pages long, and so I'm going to spare you and just read 2 verses. So the cat on his fiddle played hey diddle diddle, a jig that would wake the dead. He squeaked and sawed and quickened the tune, while the landlord shook the man in the moon. It's after 3, he said. With a ping and a pong, the fiddle string broke, the cow jumped over the moon. And the little dog laughed to see such fun, and the Saturday dish went off at a run with the silver Sunday spoon. That sounds an awful lot like a very certain English nursery rhyme. And if we understand Middle-earth as a mythical prehistory of Europe, then this makes perfect sense. Bilbo wrote the original version of Hey Diddle Diddle, and then centuries of oral tradition compressed it into the nursery rhyme that we know today. Tolkien even introduced it by saying, "Here it is in full, only a few words of it are now, as a rule, remembered." Well, that's all I have for you today. Hit the button, hit the bell, catch you later.